Afternoon's panel discussion, and we will have a panel of some 4 panelists, including Bishop Nicholas on the far right, Bishop Callistos, and Father Thomas, and I will be the 4th panelist, and I will be sitting between the 2 hierarchs. I will, however, from that position, try to moderate as best I can. And we have a number of questions. If anybody wants to write a question between now and the time I sit down and bring it up, you please do so. Failing that, we will have a chance for open discussion and response to questions until about 4 o'clock. That is the plan for the afternoon. And we hope that people will be able to hear us. We, the panel, will be sitting at the table with our benefit of microphone. The microphones that you see in front of the table are for the purposes of recording, not for increasing amplification of sound in this room. And our first question, which I will announce from this podium, I'm going to address to my co-moderator, Bishop Callistos, who raised the question earlier: how much unity in doctrine is necessary before Eucharistic communion is appropriate? Would there need to be complete agreement on all theological issues, separating Catholics and Orthodox, before Eucharistic communion is established between them? I'll give His Grace the first opportunity to respond, but I certainly would ask Bishop Nicholas and Father Thomas to add some things in at the end of his remarks, if indeed they're inclined to do so. And I think we'll follow that procedure for all of the questions, that though maybe one or another of us will start the response, all of us will be invited to participate if we have something to say. But having sat on panels before, I must caution my co-panelists that if you have nothing to say, please be content with the Lord's gifts.
Indeed, I remember once sitting on a panel which I said nothing at all, and a lady came up at the end and said to me, "I particularly appreciated your contribution." Let me first say what I think is to me fairly clear, and then raise something which is less clear. For us to receive communion together, it is surely necessary that we should share the same fundamental belief concerning the sacrament. In other words, that we should believe that the sacrament is the true body and blood of Christ. If a Christian believes, as many Christians do, that it is simply bread and wine received in memory of our Lord, I would say, in that case, you may receive the antidoron at the end, because that is exactly what we think it is, bread received in memory of our Lord. But I would hesitate to give communion to anyone who could not say with their full heart, "I believe and confess that this is indeed thine own true body, and that this is indeed thine own precious blood." I would not require that they held any particular doctrine about the Eucharistic presence, but I would expect that they should believe in the real, immediate, and true presence of Christ. That, as the Seventh Ecumenical Council said, the sacrament is not simply an icon of Christ, it is the true body and blood. Is that enough? Here, some would say no. But to me, as an Orthodox, the question of the papal claims is important. The First Vatican Council said that the Pope had supreme ordinary jurisdiction over the whole Christian world. As an Orthodox, I cannot accept that. But that is a dogma for the Catholic Church. I hope that this question of the papacy can be resolved, but I would hold that this is of deep importance for our understanding of the nature of the Church on earth. And therefore, until this matter of the nature of papal primacy has been further clarified, I don't feel that we Orthodox can receive communion with Catholics.
Bishop Nicholas, would you care to, you want to pass?
No, I'll pass right now.
Brother Thomas? Okay, well, perhaps we can come to a question on which hopefully we all might have something to say. And what do you mean by ecumenism? Do we all mean the same thing by this term? Brother Thomas, would you like to begin?
Well, I'll begin. I think there is a confusion in the use of the term today. And I can testify to this from my service in Geneva. I believe when the ecumenical movement started in a sort of formal way, and we're talking now the 1920s, the 1930s, the reference was always to the reconciliation of the Christian churches. That was the ecumenical movement, the concern for reconciliation, the concern for unity. Eventually, we became more refined in our language. We started to talk about visible unity. But initially, as I read the history, ecumenism, ecumenical movement referred to Christian churches seeking reconciliation. As far as I know, that is still the definition, you might say, that the Orthodox give to it. When the Orthodox speak about the ecumenical movement, we're talking about the movement of Christian churches and communities. As far as I know, that's what the Roman Catholic Church takes the ecumenical movement to be as well. But we find among us many other churches that are what they would say they are broadening the definition of ecumenism. Broadening the definition, quotation marks. And that often means that they're concerned with what they sometimes refer to as a wider ecumenism. That is to say, relationship between Christianity and other religions. This is creating a problem. It's a kind of a problem now in terms of what we mean as churches when we speak about the ecumenical movement.
Father, could I ask you to speak louder if possible?
Okay. Well, let me stop there. That's my contribution.
Bishop Nicholas?
I tend to agree with Father Tom there, that the idea of ecumenism is the working relationships to understand each other better and to work toward this reconciliation. I think in the process, particularly in the last number of years, the development of it and with some of the Protestant backgrounds has been the idea that yes, there is, by the fact that we say ecumenism, we can do things together, we can commune together, etc. However, it is the process in which we are working toward.
If I may add something to that, but along the same lines, I was thinking that ecumenism is, in a certain sense, a difficult word to define. I think that one can define it in terms of documents upon which various bodies and perhaps various individuals agree, but it seems to me that it is a matter of a journey towards ultimate unity in Christ, which is heavenly, a parousiac value, something that is only going to be completed in God's good time. And really, how does one trace or define a journey? Almost by definition, a journey has a goal, but there is something open-ended about it, and it admits of side trips and pauses as you are concentrating on one or another aspect of the journey. So I think there is a tension, shall we say, almost between a Webster's definition of ecumenism and even the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of ecumenism, and the reality of what ecumenism is, which I think is a journey which cannot be sharply delineated.
To me, the difficulty with the word ecumenism is that it means different things to different people. And when somebody says to me, as Orthodox do quite frequently, I am against ecumenism, or I consider ecumenism to be a heresy, my next move is to say to them, well, what do you in fact mean by ecumenism? And usually what they mean by ecumenism is an extreme form of the branch theory. They think that ecumenism means that you are obliged to consider all Christian denominations to be on an equal footing, that none of them has the fullness of the truth, that they are all equally right and all equally wrong. And they, as Orthodox, object to such a view. So do I. But that, I think, is a misunderstanding of the way other people are using the word ecumenism. But very often it is assumed by the more intransigent wing of the Orthodox Church that anyone who comes to meetings like this holds this kind of branch theory. And we have to make it abundantly clear that we don't. And for me, I would be bound to say that I believe the Orthodox Church to be the one true Church of Christ on earth, using traditional language. That does not mean I consider there is no saving grace outside the visible limits of the Orthodox Church. But at least it means I'm not an ecumenist in the sense that they think I am. I would add here that a crucial point within the Orthodox Church is this, and this may shock some of you who are not Orthodox, but there is still a very considerable body of opinion within Orthodoxy which holds that there is no saving grace outside the visible limits of the Orthodox Church. Now, people who believe that don't usually come to meetings like this, so you don't hear that point of view. But I think that is a crucial and fundamental point, whether you think that or not.
Thank you. Father Thomas, did you want to add anything? Okay. Let me ask now another question. And there are two questions on this card, both of which are rather practical. And the first is, in regards to the Eucharist, how is the question of leaven or unleavened bread to be addressed? Would anyone care to start?
I would hope that that question doesn't become a major point of contention again for history. I think the sign value of the leavened bread is a much healthier sign, but I believe in the economia of the church, and if they decide to use hosts in the Roman tradition, I don't see any major problem with that for them. I think the sign value is beginning to develop more and more in the West, and maybe the West will come around to using leavened bread, but I don't think there's any more of a theological issue with that in our society today.
Well, since Bishop Nicholas addressed the West, and I guess I have to serve as the spokesperson for the West, at least in this limited panel, I would certainly say that among the sacramentologists and the liturgists, there is a much greater appreciation of the sign value of the unleavened bread, and certainly many pastors of churches that I know, particularly when they are dealing not with the huge metropolitan cathedrals where you may have 1,000 or so people, but where they would have smaller Eucharistic celebrations, do use unleavened bread. It's become a common leavened bread. It has become a fairly common practice in that kind of a setting. Would you care to say anything on that topic? Or?
I recall that the Council of Florence in 1438-39 concluded that this was not a dogmatic issue, that it was a question of different customs, and we shouldn't turn customs into dogmas. And like Bishop Nicholas, I prefer the use of leavened bread, but I'm not going to unchurch people for using unleavened bread.
You know, and I would say from within the Western tradition, there was actually a pastoral problem with regard to the use of unleavened bread, those hosts, insofar as I think occasionally you have to teach people that it is real bread. Since it doesn't, you know,
Sign value.
the sign value is lacking. And, I mean, we can discuss that sacramentally and liturgically, but when you have to teach the meaning of a sign for it to signify, then a great deal of the sign value has been lost. Interestingly enough, the language that Bishop Nicholas used to speak of it was hosts. And within the Western Church, we would rather speak of hosts rather than of bread. And that is certainly only one of the several meanings of hosts, whereas apart from the metaphorical uses of bread, that is a fairly an unequivocal term, even though it might be made of any different kind of grain. Okay. We have another practical question, and this is addressed to the Easterners particularly, well, maybe not particularly. How will we, Catholic and Orthodox, be able to address the question of a common Pascha or Easter?
I think that's just the question for Father Thomas.
Right. This is why we are co-moderators.
Well, everybody knows how we calculate the date of Easter, right? Everybody knows the formula? The first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox.
Right.
Both the Western Church and the Orthodox Church follow this formula from the Council of Nicaea. Council of Nicaea. The problem is, over the course of years, tables were developed in order to try to predict the date in advance. And because of difficulties with calculating, and again, if we just kind of make it very practical, because of difficulties in calculating when the equinox would be, when would be the Sunday after the equinox, we've run into some variations. The change in the calendar in the Western Church, Pope Gregory essentially tried to deal with this problem of reestablishing the proper connection with the spring equinox. Most recently, this has been a topic that has once again come up among the churches because especially because next year will be an opportunity for all of the churches to observe Easter together. And as a consequence, there has been some talk, and these are discussions that reemerge every once in a while, but of late there has been some discussion about what would be the possibilities of trying to come to some sort of agreement with regard to celebrating Easter together every year. Some people have proposed what is referred to as a fixed date, a certain Sunday every year. In other words, people say, well, it's simply easier. You know what Sunday it's going to be, whether it's the second Sunday of May or the whatever, you know what it's going to be. Most recently, we had a consultation of Orthodox Roman Catholic and some Protestant churches in Aleppo a few years back. And essentially, this group of people tried to recommend that the churches not go in the direction of a fixed day, that the churches try to remain faithful to the Nicene formula so as not to create further divisions, but perhaps more accurately determine the date of Easter based upon the correct reading of the Nicene formula. So you may have heard this past Easter some reference to that. The previous Easter, there was a great deal of discussion about that. I'm sure next year, when we're all celebrating Easter together, there'll be some more discussion about that. Some people have become concerned about the fact that the resurrection is meant to celebrate our reconciliation with the Father. In other words, it's a celebration of unity and reconciliation. And what kind of message do we give to the world when we as Christians are divided over that celebration? This is especially true in places where Christians are a minority, such as in the Middle East. They tell us that the Muslims often remark and say, well, how many Easters are you going to celebrate this year, Christians? Again, here in America, we see this as an issue of being different. One group has its Easter, the other group has its Easter, one group has its Christmas, the other group has its Christmas. We sort of look upon it as opportunities to express our differences. Fine. But what does this say to the world around us? What does this say to reality itself when Christians themselves cannot come to agreement on some fundamental observances that are, especially the observance of the resurrection, which is meant to be essential to our faith? So it's an open question. I think the important thing is people are beginning to look at it, to think about it, to look at the implications of either celebrating together separately, following Nicaea, or abandoning Nicaea.
I'd just like to make a brief comment. As Father mentioned, the Middle East is very, very difficult with the Muslims. They laugh at us as we have, especially when it's a week apart. Oh, you're nailing them up again? And, you're killing him again? And it's very, very scandalous, I think, to this point. In Orthodoxy, representing so many churches, it's kind of difficult to make a decision and everybody walk with that decision. I believe that if the major bodies would make that decision and follow a common date, there's going to be divisions again. I don't like creating unity by making more divisions, personally. I personally feel in the Middle East we have option, each diocese has an option to celebrate with the majority. If the majority around us are Orthodox, we follow that date, and vice versa. My personal feeling, the way to get over this whole hurdle, since the Roman Church has one spokesman and the major majority of people will follow, I really believe as a sign of reconciliation that the Pope should make the change to accept the present system that the Orthodox follow. And it would be a move toward unity. Now we have one day. Finish this arguing, how are we going to calculate it? Worried about a calendar and 13 days difference and maybe 20 days difference in the future. It's becoming scandalous. It's much more scandalous today, I think.
Grace?
This year, so far as I can see, we Orthodox were quite simply wrong. We had the vernal equinox, then the full moon, then the Sunday after that the West kept Pascha, and we kept it a week later. So as far as I can see, we Orthodox were quite simply not following the rules of Nicaea. That first of all. Secondly, I'm very glad that there is no strong body of opinion wanting a fixed Easter. The date of Easter, by the traditional calculations, depends both upon the moon and upon the sun. And this is important. If you have a fixed Easter, you are making it depend solely upon the sun. And you're breaking the link with the Old Testament, with the keeping of Passover, with the texts in Exodus about the full moon. Some people say, so what? It really doesn't matter. But that, I think, is only an indication of our insensitivity today to the cycles of the sun and the moon. We have lost an organic relationship with the world round us, and we no longer care. And if we don't notice the full moon, so much the worse for us. We are impoverished. So I think we need to keep the traditional method, which has very deep roots in the natural order. Thirdly, we Orthodox, as you know, have a continuing division over the introduction of the new calendar for the fixed feasts, which was done in 1924 by some Orthodox churches, not by all. And in certain countries there are schisms over this and breaches of communion. And in fact, the old calendar position in certain areas is on the increase, particularly in Russia. So we Orthodox are going to be very cautious about doing anything over the date of Easter, because we don't want to have a Paschal schism to compound the existing schism over the new calendar. We would say better to let well alone. Or it's not exactly well, but let not so good alone, lest you have something yet worse.
Well, thank you, and I must say that I fully appreciate that reference to the nature that God has created for us, the great lights in the heaven, of which the book of Genesis speaks so poetically, in fact. And I think that is in keeping, too, with the recent concern about respect for nature, the environment, the green movement, and all of those kinds of things that are awakening us to the fact of a reality that is present in our sacramental system, because we use natural elements, the very basic elements of fire and water and so forth, and light, wine, bread, when we celebrate. And we really have to see that we are not simply humans in communion with God, but with that the whole creation is groaning, as Paul would say, for redemption. And I think a sensitivity to the cycles of the moon and the cycles of the sun, or our cycle with respect to the sun better, is something that we ought to keenly be aware of. Our next question is this. When we are present at the Eucharist of another church and are not allowed to receive communion, can we make an act of spiritual communion in our heart at the moment when the others are receiving communion outwardly? How should this be done? Who would like to begin?
Very simple. I think whoever wrote the question came up with the answer. At the moment, you make a prayerful thing to yourself internally, and certainly you're not receiving the Eucharist, but it's a spiritual issue.
This was a theme I remember many years ago, much stressed by the chaplain of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius in Britain, the person who wrote under the name a monk of the Eastern Church, Father Lev Gillet. And he used to give talks about the meaning of spiritual communion, and he saw this as a way forward on this very delicate question of intercommunion. And I think it's a pity that we don't think enough about this, and teach people that they can do this, instead of feeling deprived, that they can make a positive act.
I would add that in my own Latin Roman tradition, this language of spiritual communion is language with which I grew up. And we use the language not in terms of being present while Eucharist was being received in the church of another communion, because if we dared to cross the threshold, we also crossed the threshold of excommunication, or at least came close there too. However, we had a fairly rigorous discipline with regard to fast before communion, with the result that on the Sundays or celebrations that were later in the day, there were very few who received communion sacramentally. We also had a very rigorous discipline with regard to the reception of the sacrament of reconciliation before Eucharist, and perhaps an even more rigorous practice than official discipline in that regard. And for those who did not receive communion, either because they were not fasting as was required, or because they were not in the state of grace, as it was commonly said, they were encouraged to make a spiritual communion, to pray a prayer of belief in the presence of Christ, a prayer for the community, a prayer for their own unworthiness to participate, and a number of prayers that revolved around participation in the sacrament and participation in the body of Christ that was assembled there in the corporate body of the believers. So I think it would be in Latin Catholicism, for those old enough to remember, and I guess the generation is diminishing already, but those old enough to remember, it would be an easy enough thing to make the transition, to say that we are looking to, full communion in the body of Christ, full communion among those who are the body of Christ by reason of their faith and love, and when we are physically present in the church, in which we cannot presently receive the Eucharist sacramentally, then the most appropriate thing for us to do would be to offer a sincere prayer for the unity of all believers and the unity of the churches. This leads to the next question, which has to do with the communicatio in sacris, with reference to which could we go to a priest, to confession that is, to a priest of another ecclesial tradition, even though we are not yet in Eucharistic communion?
I think if we follow the communicatio in sacris, the answer would be no. Are there special circumstances? Personally, I believe yes. Extreme circumstances. Again, dying, severe illness, no opportunity for your own. I believe this is the opportunity that it can be done. It was done historically for those reasons. The Catholic Church presently accepts it historically now for those reasons. We know that the Church of Russia did for a while also, under the extreme reasons.
I agree with what Bishop Nicholas has just said, but I would like to extend the possible situations where this might arise. I have found, not very often, but sometimes, that people have come to me from other churches for counseling, and they have wanted to talk with me about their problems and difficulties, and I have not felt it right to turn them away. And then I have realized that they have certain things that they do need to say, and that they don't feel at that moment that they can say them to anyone else. And so in that situation, in order to help them to open their hearts to God and become free of the burden that is weighing on them, I have occasionally done a partial confession, in this sense that I have put on my epitrachelion and we have gone to stand in front of the holy icons, and I have assured them that they may make their confession to Christ. But I have not given them full absolution at the end. I have not laid my epitrachelion on their head, though I have read certain prayers of forgiveness. And in the Byzantine rite that is easier, because there is a variety of prayers provided in the Evcologion for forgiveness, not one single prayer of absolution, but a number. And of course we do not have a single formula, as in the Latin West, ego absolvo te, I absolve you. We have a number of prayers more deprecatory, saying, may God forgive you. And I have used those prayers, but I've told them they must also go for sacramental confession in their own church. That would be as far as I would extend it, though if people are being prepared for reception into the Orthodox Church, and perhaps they have belonged to another church but have been lapsed for many years, then I would hear their confession perhaps on a series of occasions before their actual reception, because they may have quite a lot that they need to say. And then again, I would not give them full absolution, but I would put on my epitrachelion, and then the absolution will come in the service of reception.
I think I would basically like to underscore from a theological and Western practice what Bishop Callistos has said. And I would make a distinction not so much between confession and absolution, but the distinction between confession and reconciliation, as we are commonly using the language in the Latin West at the present time. And I empathize with and fully agree with, in fact, what he has said about people coming to a priest from another tradition and sharing with the priest their problems. I think there are occasions, and I have been in several circumstances like that, and it's quite a different experience from spending hours in the confessional box, which I did as a young priest before the great feasts in our Latin church. But people who will come to the priest because they are looking for spiritual guidance, they are looking for their difficulty. And they come to the priest as much because they consider the priest a holy person, a man of God, as they consider the priest a representative of an institution. And it seems to me that in the dynamic discipline of the sacrament, the principal element in the confession is coming to a man of God, whereas the act of absolution or the act of reconciliation, one is almost acting as a functionary of the church, if I could put it that way, in less than proper, theological language. And I think those two elements are often in tension, and hopefully they would be in tension more often than they presently are, because oftentimes, at least in my pastoral practice, people are coming just simply to confess their sins and are not really sufficiently prepared or willing, to really discuss their spiritual state, before the Lord. certainly in the church in which I grew up, properly catechized, so I thought then. The important thing was to say them all so that you would get absolution for them all. And if I'm allowed a pastoral note of an extreme case in that regard, I was conducting a weekend retreat one time, and there was a question box in the retreat house, and I thought that I would look at the questions asked by high school students during the week. And one of the seniors in one of our Catholic high schools had asked this question. I am on retreat, and I will be going to confession, and on Saturday I will be taking my girlfriend out on a date, and we will be petting. May I confess that sin today? So if you get the confession in advance, then you're allowed one sin in consequence. But the emphasis was so much on the confession and the absolution. The other more human elements, the elements of metanoia, opening one's life to the Lord, were unfortunately all too often overlooked.
I'll make just one more comment on that.
Yes.
We have a problem here in the understanding of confession, a very strong problem, especially East and West, where a much more personal aspect in the West versus the community aspect in the East. So when we receive absolution, it is reconciliation to the body of Christ, not the reconciliation with God again. We get reconciled with God when we say, I'm sorry for what we did. But it's a reconciliation with the body. If the reconciling with the body, and the priest represents that body, it should take place within the body. It's a corporate issue again. It's a corporate issue. So the extension of this personal idea can create problems in the sacrament.
Could I add a little anecdote to that? This is, I agree very much about the corporate aspect of the sacrament. After all, confession was a public event in the pre-Nicene church. In one of the prayers of forgiveness, in the Russian tradition, we say explicitly, reconcile and unite her or him to your holy church. My story is this: it concerns a 20th century saint in the Orthodox Church whom I had the joy of meeting on several occasions, St. John Maximovich of the Russian Church in exile. He was first bishop in Shanghai, then in Western Europe, and finally in San Francisco. On one occasion, he was hearing a confession, as often happens, just before the liturgy. And so there were already a lot of people in the church. And the person said to him, "This is my sin. I recognize that it is a sin, but I feel nothing in my heart. I feel no sense of contrition or sorrow, though I know what I did was wrong." So Vladika John said to him, "Go out into the center of the church and kneel to the ground and ask forgiveness of all the people there, and come back." So the man did. And when he came back, something had changed inside him. And suddenly he felt all the compunction and contrition that had been absent before. But it was exactly because he was made to feel that his sin was not something abstract, it was a sin against his fellow humans, against the community. Then when he saw that, it changed. There are no private sins.
Thank you. Brother Thomas? Well, that finishes the 5 questions, the 6 questions that we had before us. Are there any additional questions written on cards? If not, would anybody want to address a question from the, I was going to say from the floor, from the galleries? No question from the gallery? Yes. Would you, why don't you come down here or stand up at least, and if you don't mind.
First Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, after Passover, before Passover. You all were a week late this year, not before the
Passover
Is that a factor in the Jewish celebration having to come before?
Passover is not mentioned in the Nicene formula. And again, this is something that's often reported incorrectly in our church announcements. It's not in the formula. But if the problem is the Jews themselves were altering when the Passover would be celebrated. And this created a difficulty for the Christians. So the Nicene formula, again, tries to follow the biblical guidance without necessarily mentioning the, let's say, contemporary Jewish Passover.
But this is going to be a difficulty with some Orthodox who hold very strongly that we should not keep our Christian Pascha till after the Jewish Passover. So this is a point on which there's got to be further discussion.
But I should say, I think most of the time, the present Julian calculation also follows the Passover.
Yes.
We often give the impression that the Gregorian calculation follows the Julian Passover. I'm getting the Gregorian calculation follows the Jewish Passover. The Easterners often give the impression that the West is always wrong on this, that they don't follow the Passover. And yet, if you look at the calculations, you'll see that I think 99.9% of the time, the Gregorian calendar also is following the Passover, as it did this year. And as the bishop said, I mean, the Orthodox were, in a certain sense, 1 week late in terms of the observance.
I bought a book this afternoon about the reform of the calendar under Pope Gregory XIII. Runs to about 300 or 400 pages. So, if you like, next year for Orientali Lumen, I will give a series of 6 plenary sessions on the calendar. I read that book.
Good. Father, could I ask you perhaps to identify yourself?
Father James Keller from the Antiochian Archdiocese of Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Someone on the panel, did the Nicene directly say do not celebrate with the Jews?
No.
Is that it?
The historian.
This becomes even more complicated because we do not have the exact formula from the council. We have references to it by fathers and historians after the council.
Because I read one commentator saying that was in there, but it was saying that it's part of a vestige that had nothing to do with it.
There is a reference of not celebrating with the Jews. And in terms of the Greek, it's a question, does that mean with them or after them? And if you look at the discussions John Chrysostom had about this, it's don't celebrate with the Jews. In other words, don't follow their calculations.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to have one more question. Yes.
To Bishop Nicholas in particular, but to other panelists.
Well, might I suggest that you stand and remember you're addressing the galleries as well?
To Bishop Nicholas in particular, and to the other panelists as they care, could you describe the reality of Communio in Sacris, particularly among the Antiochian communities in the Middle East? To what extent is there really a rather porous barrier to communion between the faithful in Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere in the Middle East? And how do the respective hierarchies deal with this fact?
I think of late, the communicatio sacris is very limited. In the 18th century, 18th century, it was very common at the time of the division, because the division was not a planned thing, but an infiltration from the west and also agitation in the east, particularly because Antioch was being controlled by Greeks and they didn't like that. So at that point there was a lot of intercommunion. From the years after that, for about 100 years after Rome prohibited it, it probably stayed very minimal. It gained again, but of late it's toned down. It's toned down. It does take place. It does take place, not in great numbers, I'm sure. I know for one diocese particularly, the Orthodox bishop has one group of people far out on the Euphrates where we have a church, and he visits every year and celebrates the liturgy with our priest and brings a priest with him and has openly told the people, this is your parish, this is where you come, this is where you worship, this is where you commune, until such time that we have a church. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, many times are done together with priests participating from other traditions. Of course, the main celebrant, if he's Orthodox, does it, but the other ones take some of the prayers. This has always been done. Of late, with our initiative towards unity, which we know certainly is not an easy thing, and it has ups and downs and pros and cons, and we'll leave them out right now, but the proximity of our people and the breaking of the barriers has been very healthy, where since 1995 until now, we are building two churches together, one in Damascus and one in Aleppo. The Orthodox and the Melkites of Damascus are building a church, and Aleppo the same thing. Both patriarchs, both bishops of those areas are participating, committee of people. They will schedule set services, a Catholic service and an Orthodox service, but they're building them common in these new suburbs where we're spreading to, so that when unity takes place, there's one parish church.
Well, that seems to be a very hopeful sign on which to conclude, especially as this is the last formal discussion, I guess, of Eucharist as a sacrament of unity. And we have just heard a couple of examples of how a visible sign of the unity for which we all hope and pray, and to which we have dedicated these days of study and prayer, is now taking place. That gives us hope. It has already given an initial round of applause, but I certainly would like to thank Bishop Nicholas and His Grace Bishop Callistus and Father Thomas for serving with me on this panel. Again, I suggest a round of applause before we have the word from our sponsor.
manner of evil against you for